Welcome to Behind Time. In this format I review a game that is already released for a couple of weeks, months or more, considering patches and the long time experience with it. Today we look back at Dark Souls 3. I keep this video as spoiler free as possible. I only show footage of the tutorial area including the first boss fight and the hub area, so 15 to 20 minutes into the game. To put that into relation, this is, depending on your pace, a 25 to 40 hour long game. But let's start. To have a point of reference for this review, I have played every Souls game out there a lot. You have a different expectation and also see different value in many aspects of the game if you are totally new to the series or if you have played it for years. This is especially true for a third Dark Souls game or the fifth game in the Souls series, including Bloodborne, which I usually call Blood Souls. First of all, I want to focus on the strengths of Dark Souls 3. There's almost no doubt about it that its biggest strength must be the presentation. We have that well-crafted art style and an impressive soundtrack, which both create a special atmosphere. We have high fidelity graphics, Souls-typical animations which are not totally realistic compared to, for example, Uncharted 4, but do an impressive job when it comes to visual communication, small details, clearness, readability and efficiency for the combat system. And we have an impressive introduction of enemies and bosses. I won't spoil it, but some boss introduction cutscenes are so memorable that they will be remembered in the Souls community. Obviously, the visual aspects of the game are very subjective, but you can see the effort, with a few exceptions here and there. If you compare it to the older games, you see more decorations and more detailed assets, even though some visuals will remind you of Bloodborne. And here we come to a potential problem that depends on your expectations. This issue is not only present in the game's visuals, but also in its levels, locations, items, weapons, NPCs, story, lore and other elements of the game. Dark Souls 3 will remind you a lot of other Souls games. You will see Bloodborne in it, you will see Dark Souls 1 in it, a lot of Dark Souls 1, small bits of Dark Souls 2 and even bits of Demon's Souls. And this is very dependent on your previous experience with the Soul franchise. If you have never played a Souls game before, you probably won't even notice, but if you are a Souls veteran, you will see it, and here we have a big breaking point in the series. Even though all Souls games share some names, items and ideas, all of them, except for 3, are very independent. They stand on their own. You can play in whatever order you want. You won't miss much. Dark Souls 3 breaks heavily with this tradition. You could describe it as an homage to Dark Souls 1 or even Dark Souls 1.5. Some would say it is fan service the game, even though the fan service is not done cheap for the most part. And here we are at a strange point that somewhat divides the community. Some expected, as always, a more independent game, a totally new adventure that improves a bit on probably flawed ideas of the past games. But that is not what Dark Souls 3 is. But some want exactly what Dark Souls 3 is, and some are new to the series and enjoy it for what it is. Does this make Dark Souls 3 a bad game? Definitely not. It is just expectations. I could just end my review here, but let's have a deeper look at some design decisions. Dark Souls combat is about avoiding getting hit and finding time frames to attack while managing your resources like time, stamina, HP, healing or damage. To avoid getting hit, Souls games give you several different tools. Shields are very independent on timing, but blocking hits costs a lot of stamina and decreases your damage output. Just positioning and staying out of range is also timing independent and does not really cost stamina, but often it has no damage potential, at least if you are playing a melee character. Then we have rolling. It often costs less stamina than blocking and allows you to position for a counterattack, but it is very timing dependent, and if you mistime your roll, you will get hit, so it has a risk. And we have parrying. It is just an extreme form of the previous one. It costs not much stamina, but has an extremely narrow timing and has its high risk, high reward mechanic. In addition, it does not work on all attacks or enemies. Dark Souls 3 started with the idea of faster combat. One mechanism to achieve this was making rolling costs cheaper and a bit more safe again. For example, Dark Souls 2 nerfed, among other elements, the incredible powerful roll. Dark Souls 3 buffed it again. With the decision to increase the pace of the combat, they ended up reducing stamina costs. While you would run out of stamina after 3 to 4 rolls in previous games, you can now easily roll 8 to 11 times in a row. In addition, the so-called iframes, the invincibility frames, are more generous again. This is pretty similar to Bloodborne, where also stamina costs and the ability to maneuver was highly increased. But what's the problem with this? To be fair, it isn't really a problem, just a difference and something I personally miss. All those design decisions reduce the value of stamina management. If you never liked stamina management and always wanted faster paced combat, Dark Souls 3 is your jam. If not, you will probably miss something. This also ties into another element, the equip load. It is very generous in Dark Souls 3, so it is quite easy to fast roll and wear heavy armor. You could think that armor is very strong then, but the developers must have recognized this problem early in the development and nerfed heavy armors into the ground compared to the previous games. As long as you just wear all 4 different pieces of armor, even if it's just a t-shirt, flip-flops, Bermuda shorts, the white gloves of Mickey Mouse and a beanie, the difference to an armor made out of dark chaos steel of protection is not that high. It is just for the fashion. It feels like this part of the game lost a lot of impact and doesn't feel very plausible. I can see that many players won't be very unhappy with this, because heavy armor could be very annoying in the previous game's PvP, and Fashion Souls was always more important than stats, but removing its impact completely isn't really the best solution either, at least from my perspective. Another topic here would be the poise value, but that goes too much into detail. But let's say it splits the PvP community. Some like it, others hate it. I think it's interesting, but brings its own problems. One of my last points is the more linear character of Dark Souls 3. In Dark Souls 1, after beating just one boss, you could fight 8 different other bosses in any order. In Dark Souls 2, in theory even 10. You had a lot of freedom in those games, and that was great exploring-wise and for the replayability. Every player had probably a slightly different journey through their game. In Dark Souls 3 that got more linear, even though you still have options on where to go next. There are not as many as in previous titles. Even though it's, from my perspective, not perfect, it's still a very good game. Should you have never played a Souls game before, maybe Dark Souls 3 is a good start, even though it helps having played Dark Souls 1 to understand the story and the lore better. The great thing about Souls is exploring the game, and that the difficulty is often based on a lack of knowledge. When you have closed this knowledge gap and learned, you will see progress and how much you have improved over time. If you are close to despair because you struggled beating a challenging boss for a while and you finally beat him, you will feel like the king of the world. This emotional roller coaster is still in the game. On the other side, if you have played Souls games before and you like impactful heavy armors and stamina management, as a very wide weapon and magic variety in PvP, as in Dark Souls 2, you will probably miss something. Also, the game isn't as independent as all the other Souls games. A lot of Dark Souls 1 and fan service is in it, but I have to admit the fan service is not done cheap, but some players, me included, will sometimes feel like I have done this before. Some gimmick bosses don't feel really well crafted, and a lot of fights are mechanically very similar to bosses from previous games. But should you always wished for Souls combat to be faster paced and never really liked the PvP of Dark Souls 2, you could really like Dark Souls 3. Also, the game's presentation is incredibly well done. The art and assets are detailed, the soundtrack is absolutely amazing, and the boss introduction cutscenes are memorable. Overall, it is one of the best games I have played this year, and I wonder what FromSoft will do for the DLCs. I hope I could give you a good overview of Dark Souls 3 and you enjoyed this video. If so, consider subscribing or following me on Twitter for updates. Thank you for watching and goodbye.